The most powerful country in the world faces a threat far more unsettling than missiles crossing oceans, far more unpredictable than distant battlefields lighting up the night sky. This threat is not external. It is internal, its own people. From the crowded avenues of New York City to the political heart of Washington, D.C., to the restless streets of Los Angeles, energy is building once again. It starts quietly, a few voices, a handful of signs, a gathering that seems almost insignificant. And yet as more people arrive, the noise grows, the tension thickens, and suddenly the streets are alive. Chants echo through concrete corridors, sirens cut through the night, lines of police form in the distance, cameras begin to roll. What starts as a moment becomes a movement. At the center of this is a name that continues to divide the nation, Donald Trump. But to understand what is happening, you must look deeper. This is not just about one man, one election, one political moment. It is structural. It is a pressure that has been quietly accumulating beneath the surface of American society for years. In the United States, protests are never merely reactions to the immediate issue. They are signals, warnings, the release of pressure that has built over time. And that pressure is rising again. America is not simply divided. Its divisions touch every layer of society. Politically, the country splits between competing visions of leadership. Economically, gaps widen between those who feel secure and those left behind. Culturally, debates over identity, values, and the nation's direction intensify. Even the concept of truth has fractured, with different groups living in separate informational realities. This is structural, not temporary. On one side are millions who see Trump as strong, willing to challenge institutions they believe have failed them. To them, he is not the problem. He is the response. On the other side, millions view him as a threat to institutional stability, governance, and the nation's long-term direction. These dual realities collide, inevitably, in debates, elections, and the streets. When stakes feel high, people act. They organize, they show up, they demand attention. But this moment did not arise spontaneously. It is part of a pattern, one that can be traced back to 2020. The killing of George Floyd reshaped modern protest. What began as a reaction to a single incident became one of the largest protest movements in American history. Millions took to the streets. Cities mobilized at an unprecedented scale and speed. But beyond that, it revealed a hidden truth. Beneath apparent stability, the U.S. possesses a capacity for rapid, large-scale mobilization. When thresholds are crossed, response is immediate and overwhelming. That capacity has left a framework, a muscle memory. Movements now form faster, spread further, and act more decisively than ever. What you are witnessing today is not just reaction. It is part of an evolving system of protest. Faster, more connected, more responsive. Timing matters. These protests do not happen in a vacuum. They unfold amid a volatile global environment. Geopolitical tensions rise. Strategic rivalries intensify. Conflicts are interconnected. The United States is deeply involved, which means that internal unrest does not remain contained. It ripples outward. Financial markets react. Allies question reliability. Adversaries reassess strategy. China, Russia, Iran, they watch closely. A distracted superpower projects less consistent power, creating global uncertainty. Within the protests themselves, there is more than opposition. There is direction. Look at the chants, read the signs, stop the escalation, stop the conflict, stop the war. Domestic protests intersect with foreign policy, military decisions, and the United States' role in a volatile world. And this raises the question, can voices in the streets influence decisions at the highest level? Or are those decisions already locked in, driven by forces beyond public reach? Modern power operates beneath the visible surface. The crowd, the noise, the movement, they are only the top layer. Beneath lies a system of institutions, strategies, and decision-making insulated from immediate pressure. And this creates tension. Can public voices reach the rooms where real power resides, or do they simply echo without effect? History shows protests can matter, but gradually, through narrative, perception, political incentives, and elections. Vietnam is the example. Millions protested for years. Public opinion shifted. Political costs rose. The war did not end overnight, but leadership responded incrementally. The lesson is clear. Protests work slowly, indirectly, but meaningfully. In today's America, protests shape perception, influence leaders, and create political pressure. But the system is insulated, slow-moving, and bound by strategy, alliances, and perceived threats. Partisan protests are limited in influence. Broad-based protests that cross ideological, social, and geographic lines carry real weight. They signal consensus, not just opposition. Leadership interprets pressure. Trump, like any president, weighs public sentiment against national security, strategy, and political survival. If leadership sees conflict as advantageous, protests may not change course immediately. Yet if public pressure shifts the political landscape, decisions may change over time. Internal unrest also has paradoxical effects. Polarization, clashes, and eroded trust can increase the likelihood of external action. The same force that restrains power can destabilize it. Voices calling for peace exist within a system that grows unpredictable as pressure mounts. The question is not simple. Can Americans stop a war? Not instantly, not with a single protest, not through one moment. Change is gradual, requiring sustained public engagement, political shifts, institutional response, and patience. Success depends on scale, unity, leadership, and global context. Scale matters. Small protests can be ignored. Medium protests can be managed. Large protests, spread across cities and demographics, signal more than dissatisfaction. They signal potential instability. Consistency matters. One day is a headline. Weeks and months of sustained presence create cumulative pressure. They force leadership to respond, keep issues in focus, and prevent the system from ignoring the moment. Unity is the greatest challenge. Polarization means protests are often perceived as partisan. Cross-spectrum unity amplifies influence, signaling broad consensus rather than narrow opposition. Leadership is pivotal. Pressure exists, but its interpretation determines response. Public pressure may shift over time, influencing approval, elections, and institutional support, eventually altering decisions. The global dimension cannot be ignored. Allies and rivals monitor internal unrest. China, Russia, Iran, and others adjust strategies based on U.S. stability. A divided America reacts differently from a unified one. Internal division shapes external action and global perception. This is the paradox at the heart of the moment. The force that can restrain power can also destabilize it. Voices calling for peace exist within a system that may respond unpredictably. Americans can influence the course of war, but only through sustained effort, strategy, and patience. The streets are speaking. The world is watching. Whether America listens will shape more than one nation. It will shape global balance, conflict, and the projection of power itself. In the streets of America today, the tension described earlier is not abstract. It is quantifiable, reported, and unmistakable. The level of civic mobilization has reached a scale rarely seen in modern U.S. history, not only as scattered local actions, but as coordinated national movements that command headlines, draw millions, and force politicians to react. On March 28, 2026, over 3,200 No Kings rallies took place in all 50 states, mobilizing millions of Americans to protest what organizers describe as authoritarian overreach by the Trump administration. These protests condemned multiple grievances, from immigration enforcement and domestic policy to the administration's foreign military actions, including a controversial conflict with Iran that has stirred extraordinary public opposition. Across urban centers from New York to Dallas, Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., high turnout was reported, while smaller towns saw protest participation grow by 40%, illustrating that the sentiment driving these rallies is not confined to coastal strongholds. It is national and widespread. The Washington Post described these coordinated actions as one of the largest protest movements in U.S. history, with participants rallying against perceived executive overreach and arguing that the democratic fabric of the country is in jeopardy. In some protests, voices were not only against domestic policy, but against war. Chants and slogans reflected growing frustration over Operation Epic Fury, the name given to the U.S.-Israel military campaign against Iran, which has drawn casualties and deepened political polarization. Protesters linked domestic unrest with foreign policy dissatisfaction, underscoring how, for many Americans, the line between domestic governance and foreign engagement has vanished. This nationwide mobilization did not come out of nowhere. Earlier in the year, demonstrations had broken out in cities like Minneapolis after federal immigration agents shot and killed U.S. citizens, including Renee Good and Alex Preddy, during enforcement operations. Those events triggered widespread anti-ICE protests, which spread to cities including San Francisco and Portland. In Minneapolis alone, thousands braved bitter winter conditions to demand that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, leave the city. This march was part of a larger coordinated strike and protest movement that connected immigration policy with broader concerns about bureaucratic power and civil rights. These events were also part of a broader historical sequence. Earlier movements like the Hands Off protests of 2025 drew millions across all 50 states to oppose Trump's second administration and defend democratic norms. Taken together, these mass actions reveal a population that no longer sees protests as isolated instances, but as ongoing political pressure, almost systemic in nature. And the stakes are higher than chance in the streets. Political polarization isn't just palpable, it's documented. Recent analysis shows that U.S. political language has sharply increased in negativity over the past decade, especially since Donald Trump first entered national politics. That escalation in tone has correlates with deeper societal divisions, reinforcing separate informational realities for different political communities. Meanwhile, public opinion on war and foreign policy in 2026 shows extraordinary fractures. In the days following U.S. strikes in Iran, support for the military action was significantly lower than what historical precedent suggests at the beginnings of other major conflicts, including Vietnam or Iraq. Polling has ranged dramatically, showing a broad lack of consensus on what role the U.S. should play abroad. This war has consequences domestically and internationally. U.S. allies in Asia, for example, are expressing deepening concern that prolonged conflict with Iran could undermine Washington's commitments to Indo-Pacific security, giving regional rivals opportunities to press their advantage. This anxiety is not just strategic. It is reported directly by allies scrambling to adjust defense postures as U.S. military resources are tied up elsewhere. Back home, these divisions are not only ideological, they are institutional. Congressional debates over authorizing or restraining military action have become sharply contentious, with lawmakers evenly split not only along party lines but within party coalitions themselves. These disagreements underscore how polarization now shapes not just rhetoric, but policy outcomes. Beyond protests and public opinion, human rights organizations have sounded alarms about the erosion of core civil liberties. Reports from global watchdogs warn that the U.S., once a standard bearer of free assembly and expression, is seeing its protest rights constrained through legal pressures, visa revocations for protesters, and the deployment of federal forces against citizens. Critics argue this is a troubling trend, one that resonates with broader concerns about democratic backsliding. These developments illustrate a stark reality. America's division is not theoretical. It is visible, measurable, and escalating. Each protest, each news headline, and each legislative fight compounds pressure within a political environment that is deeply fractured. And as the presidential midterm elections approach, that environment is not cooling, it is intensifying. Polls indicate a growing disapproval of the administration's handling of both domestic and international crises, contributing to a sense of national unease and urgency among millions of Americans. Yet despite the scale of protests and the sharpness of public dissent, the mechanisms of power, the presidency, the military apparatus, and institutional safeguards remain by design resilient against sudden change. This is not inherently bad. Mechanisms like separation of powers and insulated decision-making are meant to prevent abrupt disruptions. But when public discontent is profound and widespread, that insulation can feel to many like an echo chamber, where popular voices struggle to penetrate. This tension is the heart of America's current upheaval, a nation where massive protests are now an expected part of the political calendar, and where public pressure collides with entrenched power structures. And nowhere is this collision more consequential than in foreign policy, where protest movements now intersect with questions of war and peace on the global stage. In Part 3, we will explore how these domestic pressures shape the international arena, how global powers are responding to a divided America, and whether popular movements can alter the course of war, or whether they will be absorbed into the broader machinery of geopolitics itself. As millions of Americans have marched, chanted, and organized, the world beyond U.S. borders has not looked away, it has recalibrated. The protests in the United States are not isolated scenes. They are part of a broader, unfolding global drama shaped by war, alliances, divisions, and uncertainty. On March 28, 2026, the No Kings protests brought millions of Americans into the streets across all 50 states, marking one of the largest coordinated demonstrations in U.S. history. Participants voiced not only domestic grievances, from immigration policy to executive overreach, but also opposition to the war with Iran initiated earlier in the year. Many Americans now see the conflict abroad as inseparable from the crises at home. No kings, just democratic voice. This refrain was heard from Manhattan to Minneapolis as multi-generational crowds, including students, labor unions, and grassroots movements, demanded accountability, restraint, and change. Across the world, the conflict that has fueled these protests is itself a major geopolitical rupture. On 28 February 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran, a campaign justified in Washington as necessary for security but widely seen by analysts as fraught with risk. The operation, sometimes referred to as Operation Epic Fury, has already reverberated far beyond the Middle East. Experts say the war is reshaping regional alliances, unsettling Europe's security calculations, and forcing global powers to rethink strategy. In Europe, the conflict is seen as increasing instability, with policymakers warning of broader implications for NATO unity and energy security. In Asia, U.S. allies are growing increasingly uneasy. Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, long reliant on American guarantees for regional stability, are questioning whether Washington can maintain focus on Indo-Pacific security while deeply engaged in the Middle East. On the ground in Iran itself, the country at the epicenter of this crisis, the picture is complex. Professional monitors and experts describe hundreds of regime-organized rallies demonstrating unity and support for the government following the strikes, indicating that the assumption of widespread internal collapse may have been premature. At the same time, protests against the war, both inside Iran and abroad, have continued. In the United States and Europe, anti-war activists have demanded immediate de-escalation and diplomatic alternatives, arguing that military conflict will not bring peace or stability. These global developments underscore a critical truth. Internal division in the United States does not stay isolated. It radiates outward and affects alliances, adversaries, markets, and the balance of power. Washington's allies are watching not just the demonstrations on the streets of New York or Chicago, but the deeper signals they send about American cohesion, credibility, and resolve. At home, public opinion reflects this global domestic tension. Recent aggregate polling indicates that a large share of Americans, as many as 6 in 10, disapprove of the U.S. military action in Iran, with many believing the conflict makes the country less safe. That sentiment matters. In a democracy, national leadership, from the Congress to the White House, is influenced by public approval, shifts in voting blocs, and the political costs of prolonged conflict. But unlike a single election or policy fight, war unfolds over time, shaped by bureaucratic inertia, strategic commitments, and international dynamics that do not change overnight. And that is the paradox at the heart of this moment. Voices in the streets can alter narratives, shift political incentives, and create pressure, but they often cannot instantly redirect the machinery of geopolitics. Modern policy is bound up in institutional processes, national strategies, and global pressures that move on timelines distinct from protests. Some leaders see this as a perilous moment for American credibility. Allies interpret internal division as a signal that U.S. leadership may be less predictable and less reliable. Adversaries perceive opportunity in uncertainty. While Russia and China publicly condemn the strikes and criticize U.S. strategy, other states quietly reassess their own calculations, betting on a distracted or divided America. The global repercussions extend beyond the military realm. Economies are feeling the effects of geopolitical strain. Energy markets have been volatile due to threats to shipping lanes and strategic choke points. Supply chains are adjusting. Currency values fluctuate as investors react to risk. These are not distant, abstract concepts. They touch everyday life at home and abroad. Yet even with pressure mounting on multiple fronts, some institutional mechanisms remain firmly in place. The U.S. Constitution assigns war powers to Congress, while the executive branch retains the authority to direct military operations once conflict begins. In practice, this balance has often skewed toward presidential decision-making, and in the case of the current conflict, the White House has operated with broad latitude that Congress has yet to fully constrain. This disconnect between public will and political action is foundational to understanding why protests do not always translate into immediate policy reversal. A divided society with deeply entrenched institutions can absorb mass movements, especially when those movements themselves reflect narrow ideological bases rather than broad national consensus. So the fundamental question remains, can the voices in the streets truly influence global policy, or are they echoes against a larger, entrenched system of power? The answer lies somewhere in between. Protests matter, but as history has shown, they matter not instantly, but cumulatively. They shape public discourse, influence future elections, and alter the incentives of leaders who depend on public support to maintain legitimacy. The anti-Vietnam demonstrations of the 1960s didn't stop that war overnight, but they gradually shifted public opinion, made the war politically costly, and ultimately contributed to change. In this age of digital media and interconnected global narratives, the potential for public pressure to influence geopolitical decisions is arguably greater, but it still requires persistence, unity, and strategic clarity. Movements must transcend partisanship to become a consensus that cannot be easily dismissed. If Americans are to harness this moment for lasting impact, their protests must communicate not only dissent but constructive direction, a vision of national purpose that resonates beyond factional divides. Otherwise, demonstrations, however massive, risk being absorbed into the noise of polarization without reshaping policy at the core. The world continues to watch. Allies evaluate whether America can remain engaged on multiple fronts. Rivals calculate opportunities. Economies brace for uncertainty. And back home, millions reflect on whether unity can be forged from division, whether public voice can align with political power, and whether a nation that is loudly fracturing can still act with coherent purpose on the global stage. The streets continue to speak. The question now is not just whether America will listen, but whether it can act in a way that shapes a future defined not by chaos, but by collective will, strategic clarity, and a renewal of democratic purpose. In the end, this moment is not predetermined. Conflict may persist or subside. Protests may grow, transform, or fade. But what is certain is this: America's internal tension, projected outward, will influence not only its own future, but the future of the world.